Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara, Chapter 26. When Gus leaned in at the door next morning and said, "What's today, boss?" McLachlan began to outline a full day's work. He was planning the haying. They'd begin in mid-August. The grass was deep and ripe. They could cut early this year. The weather had been so fine that all the ranchers in the neighbourhood were getting ready to cut. Along the roadsides, the mowing machines were already laying swathes of fragrant hay flat. The air smelled different. It was said that when hay was cut in Wyoming, the perfume of it was on the wind for hundreds of miles. The mowing machines, with all their small, razor-sharp blades, must be gone over, bolts tightened, worn parts replaced, harness mended, new prongs put in the rakes, some repairs made on the stackers. Ken sat in an anguish of suspense while his father gave Gus directions that, surely, meant a full day's work. "And Gus," added McLachlan, "right now, before we begin with all that, Ken is going to halter break his filly. I want you and Tim on hand." Gus's eyes opened in astonishment. He glanced at Ken's scarlet, downcast face. "Ja, boss. Where will we do it?" "In the calf pasture. Call Tim." McLachlan rose from the table. "We'll do it right now and get it over with." Tim and Gus came down from the stable carrying lariat, halter, and a lead rope. They stood in a group just inside the fence, and McLachlan walked forward a short distance with Ken and told him to call the filly. Ken obeyed. Presently, Flicka appeared coming around the shoulder of the hill. She trotted up to Ken. McLachlan undid the red bandana from Ken's neck, handed it to him and said, "Just sling that around her neck and tie it in a loose knot." Puzzled by these strange directions, Ken obeyed, and Flicka returned what, apparently, she thought was a caress, nuzzling his neck with her nose. "And now take your belt off," said McLachlan. "Here," said Ken, in a complete fog. "Slip it through the bandana," said his father. When Ken had done that, the belt hung in a loop under Flicka's neck. McLachlan waved his hand. "Now go down the path, put your arm through that loop." Ken did so. While McLachlan stepped backward, put his arm across his wife's shoulders, and pretended to lean his weight on her, he was thoroughly enjoying himself. Ken walked down the path and Flicka hopped by his side, close to him. When they reached the cottonwoods on the hill, McLachlan called, "Now turn around and come back. Let go the loop. Just hold your hand in the air under her chin." Ken obeyed. The leather belt, the bandana, hung loose on the filly's neck. Ken's hand was in the air under her chin. He led her by an invisible bridle, and the filly followed as close as she could. "I'd call that halter broken," said McLachlan, grinning as the boy reached him. Ken was stunned. "But, Dad," he said, "but it's not a halter. Dad." "You take some convincing, young fella," said Rob, "but all right. Give us a halter, Gus." Gus stepped forward and gave him the halter. "Now put it on her," said McLachlan, handing it to Ken. Ken almost shook. He held the halter in his hands and turned to Flicka, but dared not take a step in her direction. "How shall I put it on her?" he asked, thinking of the way he and Howard had to struggle with the first halter and the colts. "Just the way I put the halter on Taggart," said his father. Ken thought about that. His father walked up to Taggart holding the halter openly in his hands, and Taggart stood there and stuck her head in it. He summoned all his courage, went to Flicka, and held out the halter. Flicka, who loved his hands, and had never felt the touch of them except in gentleness and affection, came closer, and Ken slipped the halter over her head and hooked it under her throat. "Now lead her," said his father. Ken obeyed and went down the path 20 yards or so, an easy halt and turn, and back again, with Flicka following so close the lead rope was slack. "But, Dad," said Ken, completely dazed, "how did she get halter broken?" McLachlan did not answer directly. That's all, folks, he said, turning to the small audience. Gus and Tim were both grinning. That's the way we break horses on the Goose Bar Ranch. I wish Ross Buckley had been here to see that. But Dad, protested Ken, slipping the halter off of Flicka's head. She stood beside him, nosing at it, nipping at it with her lips. Figure it out, said McLachlan boisterously as he walked away. Come on, Gus, we'll get at those machines. At noon, Ken went bathing with his mother. McLachlan and Howard had gone to town to buy new parts for the mowing machines. It was a good-sized reservoir which McLachlan had made in the little pasture between two of the meadows by damming up Deer Creek, just before it joined Lone Tree Creek. The pasture was picturesque, with towering rocks, the two streams, sparse wooded patches alternating with grass. Ken lay face down in the springboard which jutted out over the deep end of the pool. The sun beat down on his small, wet, brown body. It felt delicious. Everything was delicious, outside and inside him. Nothing to dread any more. No doors closed in his mind against thoughts and fears that made him sicken and tremble. It was all good. The sun, the water, Flicka, his father. Nell was floating as she loved to do, her ankles crossed as comfortably as if she was lying on a couch. Her head, capped in heavy white rubber, was tilted back so that the water came over her ears, and she saw the whole landscape upside down, as if she lay in the bottom of a bowl with the trees and hills and rocks walling her in. Close over her face was the deep blue of the sky, with the fleecy clouds drifting across. It was a moment of perfect rest. Every so often the turmoil of life quietened down. Things that, it seemed, could never turn out right, unaccountably did. Things got done. Worries faded away. Here was Flicka now, getting better, Rob pleased and being nice to Ken. Ken happy as a lark. Nell turned on her face, and long, lazy strokes of her arms made her slide through the water. Her brown feet, small and bony, and as naturally formed as a child's, made short chopping strokes and churned a white wake behind her. "Look at Paulie, Mother," shouted Ken, and Nell, turning her head on one side, saw the little cat on the bank, anxious and almost determined to swim out to her. "Come on, Paulie," she laughed, wondering if any cat would. Paulie longed to. She meowed eagerly. She ran up and down the bank. She even stopped, reached out her paws and tapped at the surface of the water. She crouched and strained forward as if she was going to, but she didn't. Nell waded to her, held out her hands, and Paulie flung herself into her arms and climbed to her shoulder. Walking home through the flooded meadow, they let Paulie follow, to see how she would manage it. Perhaps she would leave them and go home over the hills, but Paulie would neither leave them nor be left, nor was she daunted by the water and the deep grass. She proceeded in a series of leaps, splashing down into the water, shooting up above the grass the next moment to get a glimpse of those she was following, then disappearing with a large splash. Not even a cry came from her. She conserved every particle of energy for the difficult feat of locomotion. At last Nell picked her up and let her ride on her shoulder. Paulie promptly began to lick herself, smoothing her soft brown fur that had got wet and mussed. There were still some loose ends of confusion in Ken's mind that had to be cleared up. He had been haunted too long by the spectre of the pit. "Mother," he said, "is it absolutely certain now that Flicka isn't loco?" Nell stopped and looked down at her small son from under the big shade hat that was on her loose hair. "Are you still worrying about that?" she asked. "Well, how can he be so sure? She is halter broke, at least, kind of. I can see that. But she's not really trained. There's lots to do yet. Ankle deep in the warm water, waist deep in the fragrant timothy and redtop, with her kimono over her arm and her brief black bathing suit drying on her body. Nell stood in thought a few moments. She wanted to banish this fear forever from Kenny's mind. "Of course she's not trained yet," she said, "and you're right in thinking that it's not all going to be as easy as this was this morning. Flicka will oppose you, she will struggle, and you will have to master her. That has to be done. But darling, there won't be any trouble about it at all. It'll be easy as easy. Won't either hurt her or worry you." "Why not?" "Well, she loves you, doesn't she?" "Oh, yes." "Well, that shows that she's intelligent. And an intelligent horse that has already had some handling will fight reasonably, and that's all." "Why does it show that she's intelligent?" demanded Ken. "Well, it's just a way of putting away fear and facing the truth. What would the world be without love?" Ken was completely at sea. "Well, what would it be like here at home, on the ranch, if there wasn't any love here?" Ken said, "Oh," and his mouth made a crooked oval in the middle of his innocent face. But it did not close. Nell started forward again, and glancing down, smiled to see that Ken was unaware of the love as he was of the air he breathed, or the earth under his feet. She tried once more. "If you find love, if a person or an animal finds love, it's the same as finding safety, isn't it? It's comfort, and friendliness, and help. Everyone longs for it, any kind of love. But if Flicka, we'll say, had found it, and yet didn't have sense enough to know she'd found it, and went on being crazy and silly with fear, then she'd be loco," finished Ken, as comprehension came. He looked up at his mother eagerly. Nell nodded. Polly, sitting on her shoulder, put out her tiny rough red tongue and licked Nell's cheek. Ken shouted triumphantly, "Then she's not loco!" That night, when Ken came back from taking Flicka her oats, he walked to the terrace where his parents were sitting and said, wagging his head, "More poultices, please." Nell, who was laughing, stopped as she heard Ken's words and turned to look at him. "What's the matter?" "Her hock is swelled up again and she holds the leg up." Both his parents sat so still and so gravely for a moment that it made Ken anxious. "The poultices cured it before. They'll cure it again, won't they?" Nell got up suddenly. "I'll go down to look at it, Ken." McLaughlin went too. They looked at the wound, which was swollen and obviously painful. Her right foreleg was swollen too, all the way from the knee up to the scar of the chest wound. Ken was alarmed when his father pointed out to him the second infection. "Can we put poultices on that too?" he said anxiously. Nell nodded. "Sure. It won't be an easy place to bandage, but we'll manage." Next time McLaughlin went to town, he brought back a bottle of serum and gave Flicka a hypodermic injection. "What's it for, Dad?" asked Ken anxiously. "For a generalized infection like this." "Generalized infection?" "Yes. She had just one infected place, on her leg. This chest wound was all healed up and never had been infected. Now it's infected. The infection came through her bloodstream from her leg. That's called a generalized infection." McLaughlin spoke in a casual, matter-of-fact way, and Ken's anxiety was allayed. "Will it get her well quick, Dad?" he asked, beaming. "Hope so, son. Sometimes it helps a lot. Sometimes they seem to do as well without it." "Where'd you get it?" "I got it from Dr. Hicks." The name of the vet always made Ken think of money, and it gave him a shock. That thing his father had said, "You cost me money every time you turn around." "How much did it cost, Dad?" They were walking back together. "It cost $10. Ken stopped walking And McLaughlan strode on without him, heading for the tool house, near which Gus was working on one of the mowing machines. $10? $10? When his father crabbed about every penny the boys spent, about a forkful of hay. Ken ran up to his father. McLaughlan was already arguing over the blades with Gus. "Dad," he began. Well, McLaughlan's head was raised from the machine. I didn't know what you said. You remember?" "Well, out with it," roared McLaughlan impatiently. "That I cost you money every time I turn around. I didn't see how I could. But now, why, Dad, $10? Thanks ever so much, Dad." $10? shouted his father, with a twisted, sardonic grin on his mouth. "Why, for you, Kenny, that's nothing. A mere wave of the hand. You're the boy that threw away $300 just looking out of the window for an hour." Why, I never. $300? "Go on away and let me work," roared his father, and bent his head again over the machine. Ken found his mother. She was busy too, sorting the laundry, sitting on her heels on the floor, picking over a big pile of shirts, blue jeans, socks, and linen. Ken posed the problem. "How did I, Mother? I never did I?" Nell laughed and wrote 6 pairs blue jeans on her list. "Yes, you did. You looked out the window for an hour when you should have been writing a composition. So you weren't promoted, and you have to repeat the grade, and it costs about $300 for 1 year's schooling for you." $300? breathed Kenny with awe. "How can it?" "Count it up. 8 months' board at $25 a month, $100 for tuition and books. You wasted all that, you see. If you had written the composition, your father wouldn't have had to pay that over again for you." Ken went to the table, sat down and propped his head in his hand, staring down at the red checkered cloth. It could hardly be believed that such momentous things could follow the small misdemeanor of looking out of a window and neglecting to write a composition. "If I wrote it now, Mother," he said at last. "Well, I told you to do that a month ago," said Nell. "Have you done it?" "No." "Have you even thought of it again?" "No, not since when Dad said he wouldn't make me do the study." "You might do it of your own accord," said Nell, writing on her list. "He does things for you of his own accord." "I know, that's it. Mother, do you think if I wrote it, Mr. Gibson would take me back in my own grade?" Nell put down her pencil and paper and sat back on her knees. "Kenny, you write the composition, the story of Gypsy, and I'll write him a letter explaining, and we'll send them to him. And perhaps when school opens he may decide to let you try again." She began to crowd everything into the big laundry bags, and Ken got down on his knees to help her. When it was done, she said to him, "And you'd better hurry up about it. Before you know it, summer'll be over." That's the end of chapter 26. Good night.